Thank you very much for coming, everyone. As you know, the Frontline Club has a long association with trying to help fixers in the field who have been injured or killed. And, there's a fixers fund that Vaughan Smith established for the families of fixers who killed, because very often the international news organizations for which they've worked don't insure them and don't provide them compensation when they have been injured or killed. And so there's anybody who wants to give some money to the Fixer Fund after this is very welcome to either online or here or send a check. It's just worth bearing in mind that these young men and women who do come and do all this work that helps to provide the news that you see and read are not always well regarded and well taken care of by the institutions for which they work. Some are, but many are not. Now, tonight's discussion is motivated in large part by the publication of a new book. This book, The Baghdad Fixer, or Baghdad Fixer, by Eileen Prussia on my left. Eileen wrote this. It's a novel based on her own experience in Iraq of working with an Iraqi former teacher who made himself a fixer, or made himself invaluable to you, I believe.
Well, in the novel, he's a teacher, but in reality, no. The reality was the fictional character is based on several different fixtures I've worked with, and as a kind of composite, and then it's just half reality, half fiction.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. But anyway, but there's roughly this story is why, and the publication of this book, which will be sold. I'm sorry, I sound a bit asking money to the Fixer Fund and asking you to buy the book, but let's get this all out of the way and we'll come clean. And as someone whose books sell very badly myself, I'm always trying to help people to sell their books, because it's good to keep literature alive and keep people reading and keep people writing. So Eileen Prussia was a correspondent of the Christian Science Monitor in Tokyo, Istanbul, and Iraq and Afghanistan, and now lives in Jerusalem. On my right is Patrick Coburn, who is an old friend, longtime supporter of the Frontline Club, was Middle East correspondent of the Financial Times for many years, and for the last, I think, 20-odd years has been the Middle East correspondent of the Independent in London. Traveling throughout the region, has covered every war in the Middle East since he started in his career over 30 years ago, and is a very highly regarded and respected correspondent. I'd say highly regarded by his colleagues, rated very highly amongst all of his colleagues, and is the author of many books, but relevant to our discussion tonight, The Occupation, War and Resistance in Iraq, and a biography of Muqtada al-Sadr in Iraq. Now, to lend some sense of reality to this discussion, we have Sleiman Ali-Zwai, who has worked as a fixer in Libya. He is Libyan. He's a good, well-known journalist, freelance journalist, working mainly for the New York Times in Libya. And I want him, when we begin, to tell you how one becomes a fixer. I mean, how when this mad circus of the international press arrives and doesn't know anything or speak the language or have any grasp of the realities that they're facing, how they rely or find people like you, or how you find them, and start to work together so that their ignorance won't be so apparent to their readers and their viewers. I worked for many years with ABC News. I was the ABC News chief Middle East correspondent in Beirut, where the idea of a fixer was not so common in those days. It seems to have come about in much later conflicts in first Yugoslavia and then in Iraq. But in Beirut, we did have local employees, some of whom were simply criminals, padding their expenses exorbitantly and garnishing the wages of the drivers and the soundmen so that they could buy yachts. But I think the role of the fixer has advanced somewhat from those days, because one thing, there's not as much money around to steal, and another, the people who are coming to do that are actually qualified journalists, whereas many of the others in those days were drivers and really didn't have any grasp of anything. But in any case, I'm babbling on a bit too much. The truth of the matter is that if a journalist arrives in a country and knows the country intimately and has lived in the country and speaks the language and has friends and contacts there, he doesn't need a fixer. But when someone arrives with a television crew and a tape editor and a full team in a place he's never been before, where he doesn't speak the language, he barely understands what the story is because he's been reading the clips in the plane on the way over, he desperately needs local expertise and local help. And so that's why I want to begin tonight by asking Sleiman how he then helps to help guide this crew to some sense of the reality of the country where you're from.
As you said, this you don't know how you get into this business, or at the time it wasn't even a business. There was a revolution, and there was a lot of foreign journalists coming in to the country, and somebody had to show them, or at least what we thought was our job description was translating. So a friend of mine called me and he said that there was a foreign journalist who need translating. And after a while, you discover that it's not just translating. You're basically helping them do everything from the scratch. Explain the country, explain how, especially for Libya, it was closed for so many years. So to explain what the culture and what led to such a revolution, for example, that took all day. And
only one day.
I mean, you're talking about, for example, with each journalist, you spend a couple of weeks or 3 weeks. So every day, from the beginning to the end, you're between interviews, you're still explaining the situation. So from that, that was the first time I've heard the term fixer. I thought fixer was something else, like you fix things with your hands. Now it has a whole different meaning.
Would you like to have another term, a more glorified term?
Some people don't like it, but I really don't mind it. It is what it is.
But then you can graduate into being a writer or a journalist yourself.
Yeah, I mean, so as my occupation before, I had a construction business, so I was so completely away from this whole journalism thing. But you kind of get sucked into it.
It doesn't pay as well as construction.
In my case, it does. So basically, you develop relationships with the foreign correspondents who then leave, and then because they know you so much, they trust you with giving them the information from the ground, and then you upgrade yourself to a reporter, and then I'm like 2 years into it now.
And so whenever a New York Times correspondent comes, he'll rely on you when he arrives.
Yes. Or when they're not there, I can report, report for them. For example, the consulate attack in Benghazi 2 months ago.
Were you the only New York Times representative?
I was until a certain time. I was the one who did the TikTok for them.
Were you in Benghazi when it happened?
No, I flew to Benghazi immediately, though.
And do you have any insight into whether or not there were CIA prisoners being held nearby?
No.
They put your byline on the story.
They did, yeah.
That's great.
And Patrick, to what extent would a newspaper correspondent like you, who actually knows the Middle East well, rely on fixers when he travels?
It goes up and down a bit depending on the degree of violence. I mean, Baghdad don't really need a fixer to find members of the government, because I know a lot of them from down the years. But actually, as the violence got worse from 2003, you actually really needed somebody who'd say, don't go down this little alleyway, go down this one. And I don't like the look of the guys on this checkpoint. Those guys weren't there this morning. Incredibly detailed local knowledge, which even if you'd spent your life in Baghdad as a foreigner, you probably wouldn't know. In Baghdad also, of course, the guys with you, I mean, so-called fixers, are probably going to be killed even faster than you are. So they have every incentive to be real careful and know this sort of stuff. And it's that sort of detailed knowledge, I've always thought, that sort of keeps you alive. So I think that there's a difference on the sort of, depending on the degree of violence. I mean, I was in Libya my fixer was Ahmed El-Gadamsi was killed a couple of months, was killed in October, and somebody I'd recruited, and he wasn't actually killed while working for me, but in rather peculiar circumstances, that he felt that he'd sort of done quite well during the Libyan revolution, and he, at the very last moment during the fighting for Sirte, decided to join up as a soldier with the militia. And I mean, he had no military experience and got shot in the head on the second day. But when I was working with him in Tripoli, again, there was a certain moment where it really was important to have somebody who knew the checkpoints, who could talk to the guys there, see where the militias were coming from, who knew the sort of political geography of Tripoli. And I think that sort of is different from being in a situation where you need somebody who can sort of knows the telephone number of some guy you're trying to get hold of. And then it depends how much do they know and how much do you know. It's more benign relationship.
When you go to a country, or any of the countries where you've worked, for example, Iraq, how do you go about finding a fixer, and how do you determine his or her reliability and usefulness to you?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question because you always actually prefer, if it's somewhere you've been before, to work with someone you've worked with or one of your colleagues, let's say from the same news organization, has worked with. But there have been cases such as in Libya, let's say, that was more or less closed to foreign journalists, or going into Syria now. For example, when I went into Iraq in 2003. And there really weren't any fixers around who hadn't been basically working for the government. So they were kind of half fixer, half minder that were sent out by the Ministry of Information to sort of kind of pretend they were working for you, but they were also kind of spying on what you were doing and checking if you were asking inappropriate questions and that sort of thing. I mean, Patrick can speak better for those days than I can, but so what I found was a lot of journalists, if you could find someone who somebody else recommended, great, but sometimes you just really needed to find someone, and if you found someone, I was just having a conversation before with Suleiman, let's say someone who just had really great English and was kind of interested in what's happening in the country, you might end up hiring that person. And I had a few cases like that. One person I worked with in Afghanistan had been, a published Afghan poet, but basically he was running an internet cafe in Peshawar, and he decided to sort of go to Kabul as it was falling, when the Taliban were pushed back by the Northern Alliance. And next thing you know, he ended up being the main fixer for the Christian Science Monitor, and now he's like the spokesman for the Interior Ministry. So he kind of did that for a period of years, and has now moved on to other things.
Is he good?
He's excellent. I mean, he was quite amazing. In fact, he and a couple of people I worked with in Iraq, were the inspiration for the book, but he as well, because he was very well connected. And one of the things that happens is not only are you often reliant on that person, as Patrick was saying, both for your information and for your security, but you're working under such intense circumstances, sometimes traveling together, not just in the capital city, but going out into the countryside perhaps, and you end up spending sort of night and day with this person. So you better get along decently with them, and I found in many cases you get along brilliantly and sometimes get very close with them. And I also sort of lost a fixer who I had just worked with recently, and about a few weeks later had been killed in Iraq, and I found it devastating at the time. In the start of this book, the journalist is looking for a friend at the hospital in Baghdad and ends up finding this Iraqi who has excellent English because he's working as an English teacher. He had spent a year of his childhood in England, and overnight he kind of becomes her fixer. And I know so many stories like that it seemed more appropriate than somebody who had sort of been preparing for a career in media their whole lives. And I guess it's sort of maybe for the good and bad. There's something I've worked with some people who are absolutely brilliant at it and who kind of just learned on their feet and figured out the job. I also worked with people in Afghanistan who were sort of moonlighting, and they were actually physicians, you know, who worked at the hospital at night and worked with fixers, and worked as fixers with journalists during the day because they can earn so much more with a foreign correspondent, you know, than they could even on a, you know, a doctor's salary. But you know, I think the sad side of it, and that was why I asked Suleiman about whether or not he received credit for that story he wrote about the attack on the consulate, on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi, is I think there has been a steady progression towards recognizing the important work that fixers do, and that they are actually journalists in and of their own right. And I had this conversation with Lise Doucet of the BBC a few days ago, and she said, I'm trying to ban this word. And I said, well, part of the idea of this book is kind of exposing it, because, you know, there are some people who work with fixers, you know, such as the people on this panel, I think really respect what they do. I think there are also journalists who kind of go in and sort of end up treating that person as their kind of, you know, do boy, do this, do that, do the other, and sometimes putting them in danger, you know, usually inadvertently, but, you know, as was mentioned, you know, I was just looking at the statistics for, from the Committee to Protect Journalists for 2011, of all the journalists that were killed, 85% of them were local, 15% of them were foreign. So, you know, what we, people like us, will often remember is, you know, we lost some amazing journalists earlier this year, Anthony Shadid from the New York Times, Marie Colvin, but people often forget all of the local journalists who are dying in the process of gathering the stories in much greater numbers.
Has either Patrick or anyone, have you ever hired a really terrible fixer, and what made him or her seem terrible?
I've probably sort of blotted it out of my mind, actually, and quite a long period. I mean, we're thinking back in recent years, not, because I mean, a place like Baghdad, of course, what you don't want, what you sort of think about is when somebody whose guide is, would it occur to somebody that they might supplement their salary by having you kidnapped?
That would be a bad fixer.
What?
That would be a bad fixer.
That would be a real bad fixer. But yeah, I mean, everybody is sort of kind of eyeing everybody in a distrustful way, and also just who has good instincts, you know, as to you know, staying alive, and it's difficult to sort of get a balance. I mean, it's sort of, as things have got recently, all the sort of stories seem to be sort of war stories. You know, saying it's just sort of it's somebody who absolutely knows the ground is so sort of essential. I mean, in Baghdad, Kabul, you know, you go one way out of Kabul, and, you know, you go east out of Kabul, you can go quite a long way without anything happening. If you go west out of Kabul, you know, you're sort of in Taliban land almost immediately. You kind of need guys who know that. And don't find out the hard way. But let me think while you ask somebody about my last really terrible one.
I think more than bad ones, I've had the experience that I found that in a lot of the countries that we're referring to, most of the fixers are men. And on occasion when someone said, oh, here's a woman who's working as a fixer, or at the very least she's a translator and she could kind of manage as a fixer, I wanted to always give those people a chance. And I had one or two occasions where I realized that sometimes there were cultural barriers that, you know, some women would have a hard time, like, you know, just pushing their way into a group of militants and saying, all right, who's in charge here? I need to interview you. You know, there's a certain aggressiveness that it takes, that I found that there are women who can do it, but there are other women who are just brilliant, but, you know, wouldn't have that, you know, a little bit of extra moxie to kind of get the job done. And I did have a bad experience where someone, you know, picked me up at the airport in Kabul and was sort of offering to be my fixer, and I said, oh, thanks very much, and he sort of took that as a yes, and he kind of kept showing up at the hotel for the next day or two, wanting to be my fixer, but he had really terrible English. You know, it was really basic English. And when my, you know, real fixer came along, he got very angry and said, no, I had her first, and was threatening me, and, you know, and not really threatening me, but was threatening, you know, if you work with her, I'm going to kill you. And, you know, luckily it all got resolved, but there were a few days when I sort of didn't want to leave my hotel without an escort.
That's not an unusual experience.
Yeah.
In many countries, yeah, that's true, because if someone's displaced or feels he's being displaced, it can create family feuds between the two families of the people involved, because there's a lot of money by local standards.
That's exactly right. It was sort of, you know, we're taking care of her, and I saw her come off the plane first. So.
When you're in Libya, when you are with people working, I mean, the Libyans working for other news organizations, your competitors, as it were,
Right.
Is there a great deal of rivalry?
Not really, because at least in the case of Libya, there isn't that many people who are still in this profession.
It was just during the revolution.
There was during the revolution or the war, and that was mostly volunteers. So there wasn't money involved, and that after the fall of Tripoli, that's when people were like, "This is good time to get paid now," and I got paid way after that.
I'm sure many of the journalists were putting your pay on their expenses anyway.
No, there was one case. I'm not going to name names, but yeah, there was one case.
Glad to see things don't change.
I thought of a terrible fixer, actually. It was in... I plotted it out. It all comes back to me. In Afghanistan in 2001. Incredibly cowardly. You would have thought... An Afghan, poor fellow actually, you would have thought you couldn't have grown up in the Panjshir Valley, and you would have thought you'd get quite used to the sound of gunfire. But he used to sort of jump at every shot. And then he abandoned me in Bagram Airport when we were being shown around in the there was a wrecked control tower which sort of looked at the Taliban lines, and he suddenly sort of disappeared. Actually, nothing much was happening.
Did he come back?
No, I sort of pursued him across Bagram Airport, actually. I was completely outraged, and for some reason disappeared. Then later I heard actually from Marie Colvin that he'd gone to work for her. And while actually during the capture of Kabul, at a certain moment the car had stopped, he'd opened the door and disappeared into the night and abandoned her. So
I think Marie would have tolerated that for a minute.
Well, not much she could do, as he disappeared. But I mean, obviously he made a mistake. The thing is, in certain situations in the Panjshir Valley or anywhere in Afghanistan, most people don't have a job. Most people are miserably poor. And it's true of drivers and others, that they will all say they will do jobs that they're not necessarily fitted to do or have any idea what it involves. They're just desperate need for money. It's completely understandable. In Iraq and a few other places, it's a bit different because it's sort of obviously so dangerous. But in really poor places like that, almost anybody's going to volunteer and say anything they can to get that job.
Is there a danger then that the foreign media will exploit these people in their poverty?
Well, to a degree, but I mean, they're the losers too. If you have a driver who doesn't know the area and said he does, then it becomes very dangerous for both of you because you don't know when you're going to sort of drive through the front lines by accident. And but it's a fairly obvious thing too in impoverished areas that people are going to promise you the world just because they're desperate to feed their families. So, I mean, it's the fault of the correspondent not to see this and make sure it doesn't happen.
I mean, why did you decide to fictionalize this phenomenon?
Well, I was fascinated for several years with the idea of the fixer and the role that he or she plays. And I, in many cases, I, hit it off very well with fixers I worked with. In one or two cases, I didn't. But I was so curious about what is the experience of being that person who's essentially was in your shoes, who finds themselves suddenly in a position that is probably the most important position in journalism, because without you the stories wouldn't be happening. So essentially, you have to play a sort of almost like a cultural membrane between American or British Western culture and Libyan or Iraqi or Indonesian culture, because I'm thinking of this fixer I worked with in Indonesia. I'll tell that story afterwards. But
assuming a bad fixer? No.
Yeah, a little bit. It was I mean, there are these times in Indonesia where they're sort of like kind of mass marauding, where kind of like one group slaughters another group, and hundreds of people die. And I was doing one of those kinds of stories, and this woman told the story of how she lost her husband, and I just got into the car, and it hadn't had this kind of effect on me in a while, but I just got in the car and I cried, and I didn't feel bad about it either. It was like, if you can't go out and be affected by the stories that you hear of hearing people day in and day out and what they're going through and losing their own family members, and not occasionally let it affect you, then maybe you're just becoming too hardened to be doing the job properly. Something's wrong. But she just looked at me and said, I've never seen a journalist do that. We hear this stuff all the time. What's the big deal? And and I wondered what she would say about it now. But I felt like I wish I had gotten in the car and cried more times in my career, than because usually you don't. You just go back to the hotel and write your story and have a beer in the evening and, say, well, that was pretty awful, and that's that. The question you were asking about fictionalizing it, I was so curious about it, and every once in a while there have been a few cases where you'll see someone who does a profile of a fixer. There was one about an Iraqi fixer in the New York Times Magazine a few years ago. But as a journalist, you usually, you're lucky if you could take a whole week to work on a profile about someone. You might, if you're working for a place like the New Yorker, the Spectator, to spend a long time working on a piece. But more often than not, we have less time to work on stories. And I think particularly in the last few years with sort of the demands of blogs and Twitter and et cetera, there's a sort of a demand for faster journalism and putting out more and more copy and having less time to work on longer stories. So I had this kind of enduring curiosity and found that after basically after 10 years of being a journalist, in my spare time, I was more drawn to writing fiction, even though I was a journalist in my real life. So this combination of really loving good fiction and wondering what is it like to be in the shoes of the fixer made me want to tell this story and tell it from the perspective of the fixer. What is it like to be in his shoes, having to face the demands that he's facing from this American journalist who comes to Baghdad at the height of the war? So that was really the main motivation, and I did some of the things that come out in the novel. There's this investigative story that has to do with false documents, and I did touch on a few stories like that while I was working in Iraq, and I felt like I really wanted to put it together in a way that wasn't just sort of regurgitating what happened, but to say what if it had actually turned out this way, and also to be able to really get into the shoes of these characters, imagining what they're going through, and see where that story takes us. Because I think, when we're working journalistically, I feel very strongly about, you could never make a composite character or play with, what's really going on in this character's head, which you can really only do in fiction. And I wanted the audience, as it were, or readers, to come to this book and to meet a fixer like Nabil, to meet a person like Nabil, who is this main character in Iraq, because I guess I just feel that, in general, the Middle East, where I'm from, which is from the States, is just very maligned and misunderstood. And I thought, if people would meet somebody like Nabil, they would look at the Middle East a little bit differently.
I think other fictional portrayals of this kind, I didn't call them fixers in those days, but there's The Year of Living Dangerously, Mel Gibson, and Linda Hunt plays the equivalent of a fixer,
right,
brilliantly.
Yes.
And then, of course, in The Killing Fields, Sidney Shamberg leaves behind his friend and the man who helped him get all of his stories. But in both of these, it's the fixer who is left behind when the Western correspondent is choppered out and disappears, and he's left behind either to die or to be taken, as Pran was, to prison camp. They always seem to suffer a worse fate. Do you find that you've ever been abandoned, or your colleagues have been abandoned? Of course, you've only worked in Libya, you haven't worked elsewhere.
Yeah, I've only worked in Libya. But I think the main issue is, the relationship between the fixer and the journalist is usually, it depends on the chemistry like anything else. But, you work with a journalist for a few weeks, and eventually the foreign journalist will leave. And, for example, if they write something about a certain someone that they don't like, you're left behind. And it's not that the foreign journalist doesn't want to help you, but there isn't like a staff job for fixers in that magazine or newspaper or something that would ensure your safety, nor ensure that your family is looked after you're gone. So it's not. I think it's the main problem between fixers and journalism is the relationship between the fixer and the organization, not the journalist, because they're not treated as staff, even though they're taking the same risks. And
that is a problem in many countries where the local representative, be he a local correspondent or a fixer, will carry the can for something that's been filed by his institution. I remember in Damascus, in about 1974, a car bomb went off in Damascus, and Nick Luddington, who was the Associated Press correspondent in Beirut, happened to be there, and he did a story on it, and he went back to Beirut. the Mukhabarat in Syria then went looking for Louis Ferris, who was the local AP man. He was also the local ABC News man. But they couldn't find Louis. They heard he was in a bar somewhere, and they went up to, unfortunately, another journalist called Malik Hosseini, who was the local Reuters correspondent. And they thought he was Louis Ferris. And they said, "Come with us, Louis." He said, "I'm not Louis." And he went to show his press card. When they saw him going there, they broke his wrist, beat him up, and took him off until finally, when they searched him, they found out he wasn't Louis Ferris, he was Malik Hosseini, so they let him go. But Louis went into hiding for about a week until everything calmed down, and then he wasn't bothered. Louis Ferris was a classic case of a fixer who started out as a UN translator just before the October War in 1973, and then in 1973 met a lot of the journalists who suddenly arrived in Damascus to cover the October War, and became a representative of several large organizations, and then became extremely rich and set up a side business bringing Filipino girls and East European girls into the country as ostensibly as dancers, which gave him then great blackmail potential in Syria.
I mean, I think he became the Filipino consul, didn't he?
He even became the Filipino honorary consul.
Representing those who might have be facing difficulties there.
Yeah. Then he died under very mysterious circumstances.
As one would.
Yes, exactly. So on that happy note, I would like to open it up for questions. I'm sure most of you will have some questions roughly on this topic for any of the three panelists. This is Steve Weiss. Will kick off.
You mentioned the discrepancy. Oh, you mentioned the. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned the discrepancy between 15% and 85%. My question is: you're saying that the indigenous people put themselves more in harm's way than the foreigners who came to do the studies? I don't quite understand.
Well,
what the difference is.
I think there are a few things. I mean, it was a statistic from the Committee to Protect Journalists, and they show how many journalists died in the world each year, and how many of them were sort of indigenous or local to the country they're working in versus foreign correspondents. So I quoted it just to point out that how many more in conflict zones are dying are people who are local or native born as opposed to foreign. But in terms of putting themselves in danger, I mean, I definitely can remember there was a period of time in Iraq that, most of the time that I spent there was during 2003 and 2005. There was a period around 2004 and in 2006 when things got so dangerous, and it was sort of, you were just waiting for the next foreign journalist to get kidnapped, where journalists were basically advised to spend most of the day at the hotel and sending the fixer out to do the reporting. And it was kind of just what was done for a time, because it was considered to be that, as a journalist, you were almost, being silly if you were out too much. You were supposed to sort of go to appointments. Just as a foreigner, exactly. I mean, there was, the kidnappings. There was, the Margaret Hassan from CARE. There were some really horrible cases, diplomats, etc. So, there was, a time when someone, a car would blow up, and, there was no question that, the New York Times was not sending, the international staff person. They would send one of the local people, if at all, to the scene to report it. So, I think, yes, there are many cases in which in conflict zones, the fixers or local staff are sort of, the front lines, literally, who are going out often ahead of time to check things out, who are putting their lives on the line. And I also think, for example, going back to the experience that I mentioned, when I was working for the Christian Science Monitor, my colleague, Jill Carroll, had been kidnapped, and she was in the car with our driver and fixer. They actually killed the fixer on the spot, just shot him in the head, and they kidnapped her, and she was released about 3 months later after intense lobbying on behalf of the Monitor, the American government, etc. She'd worked at the Jordan Times, so other people in the Middle East really worked for her to get her released, and it wasn't clear at some point if she would be released. So when I look back at that, it told me that they kept her because they knew somehow she was worth something because she was a foreigner and they could probably get money for her. And I don't know if she was paid for in the end, but there were lots of cases where foreign journalists their governments have come forward with payment to get them released. And it was sort of like, oh, just another Iraqi, and that was.
Or often those people would see the fixer as someone working for the imperialists, for the foreigners, and so would be killed, or his family killed for that reason. and particularly in Iraq.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, at some point in my novel, the fixer, Nabil, starts deciding that he's not going to tell anybody that he's working for this journalist, even, people in his sort of extended family, or, kind of in the morning, walking for about half an hour and then catching a cab to the Hamra Hotel where the journalists are staying, all these things that he starts doing to realize that he doesn't want everybody who he knows knowing that he's working for a foreign journalist, because there are people in his neighborhood who thinks you're working with the occupation, you're working with, you should join the resistance and not be helping the Americans and the British.
Any other question? Another question? Be careful when you move your hand.
Hi there. At a time when a lot of international media companies are cutting their budgets, is the future for fixers kind of more positive because they can kind of move into the roles of foreign correspondents, or is it negative because the budgets aren't there for foreign correspondents to travel anymore and for fixers to help them out?
Actually, that might be a good question for you, sir.
Fixers are sort of freelancers, so as any other freelancers, the business would decline as in parallel with the cutting of budgets for all of these media outlets. So it goes hand in hand.
But is there not a kind of another argument that the fixers can do it cheaper, so that actually if a company wants to maintain its foreign coverage and it can't have a full-time staffer there, that there's actually a kind of vacancy there that maybe you could move into?
Unfortunately, they don't do it that way. They usually prefer like the foreigner going in, whether it's a staff writer or a freelancer who happens to be there on the spot. That's the majority.
Next question? Yes, please. Yeah.
Just a very quick question. I work as a producer for the BBC World Service, and for that reason I have to deal with fixers quite often. Let me ask you, bearing in mind what you said about the fact that companies not always worry about the way they protect their fixers, what would make you, bearing in mind what you did as a fixer, what would make you safer? What could I do as a producer to make sure that my fixers are better protected?
The way that you ensure your foreign correspondents when they go into a war zone, whether it's for 1 day, 10 days, or a month, you could also ensure the local fixer. That's a way of doing it. You can't protect them from getting killed or anything like that, but at least you would help secure a future for their next of kin.
Does that not happen?
No.
So if somebody comes at you with a gun and you have no protection, is that the end of the story? I mean, you put yourself in harm's way with no protection. You don't have any people going along with you who can defend you in any way. So you're a prime target. How do you engage and talk your way out of something like this when they're in charge, really? It's anarchy.
I could speak about the days of the war, for example. If you are caught by the other side, in which case we're talking about the Gaddafi side, that means nobody could. Can they send an army with you? There is no real protection for you.
No,
they can give you a flak jacket. They can send then a security guy with you, which in this case would put you in more danger because he has the military look, and you get there and with less foreigners actually. If it's just one correspondent, you're less likely to get shot. If you are with more protection, you're more likely to get shot. It's
yeah, it's a question for Suleiman. Do you feel much kinship with perhaps some of the inexperienced or naive or clueless freelancers that you perhaps in Libya? Because I understand that in Libya there were lots of freelancers because it was easy to get to.
Or you mean the Western freelancers?
Yes,
coming in?
Western freelancers.
I haven't worked with many of them, but in a lot of cases they had at least more experience than I had. So and they were they were reckless in comparison to the veterans, for example.
Can you give examples? Can you say a bit more about that?
An example, for example, there was at the very beginning, the Frontline was very loose. There was they would take a few hundred kilometers, and within an hour they would lose a few hundred kilometers. It was a highway war, and going back and forth with cars, and us as locals, we were just going with the crowd. And so were the freelancer, for example, or in a lot of cases they are photographers because they want to be more closer to the action. The more veteran journalists, they're usually behind the crowd, looking at them, and they're moving forward but slower. So.
Another question? Yes, please.
Thanks. My question's for the journalists on the panel. So, in the absence,
All three are journalists.
I'll take the three Western journalists. Sorry, Suleiman. I'm thinking about, in the absence of the sort of a contact who a colleague has said, I've worked with this person, I trust them. There you go. What's the checklist for kind of trustworthiness that you go through? What are the kind of tells or the feelings or the things that you look for in a fixer?
Well, it's just really the sort of feel you have of somebody. And also, in some cases, there may not be a great many people you can choose. Often you just sort of need a local guide, You need, in some places, the absence of gasoline for the car, how do you get gasoline? Is there a sort of local black market? Then you have to know, some guy has to know which alleyway to go down to get some gasoline. Generally you find out the hard way, but you try not to. But it's also, are people brave enough to sort of go into the fighting, but not so sort of full of bravado that they're going to get you and themselves killed? And also, it's very sort of difficult to tell that in advance. So generally, you sort of, if it's not somebody else's recommendation, you just sort of try and figure out if somebody sort of kind of knows, if they know what they're doing.
Yeah, I would say similarly, you kind of, if you really have no recommendation at all and you're kind of going in cold, you almost have to just go with your gut and not make any big promises and kind of saying, not giving someone the impression that if you work with them for a day, it means you're going to be employing them for the next month. And whichever way is diplomatic enough to do that, to say, well, let's try out doing a story together. And this way, you feel like I've committed to doing a story with you, which might mean a day or two of work, but not necessarily a week or a month, because that is, the hardest thing. If it doesn't work out, which, I can probably count on one hand the times that happened. But if you're in that situation, then it's not the easiest thing to do, to sort of let the person know that you want to keep looking. I mean, I probably in a case like that have made up a lie and said, oh, it turns out so and so has been working with the Christian Science monitor for the last 2 years, and they want me to work with him. It sounds a little sleazy of me, but I'm just, if it's your safety is on the line, sometimes you have to bend truth a little bit and tell white lies if you want the person not to feel personally insulted. So I've probably had to.
Now that you're on this, you may not be able to pull that one again.
Yes, exactly. I'm just going to work on the next novel now.
That's why I kept losing those assignments.
Yeah.
Of course, there are two roles for the fix. There's the logistical role.
Yes.
And then there's an editorial role, getting petrol, getting food in some places, finding you a hotel, a safe house, all of that, which is not editorial at all. That's just your basic survival. Then there are those who help you find people to interview and tell you where the story is and all that. And sometimes you get all that in one person, and sometimes you need two separate people.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
And so very different skill sets. So you find someone who's really good on logistics, but no editorial judgment at all, so you just use them for logistics, and vice versa.
Exactly. I mean, and bigger, TV, for example, networks will often have several people who are doing, just logistics, just translating and fixing and that sort of thing. But when you're, a newspaper correspondent, you're more likely to have to, usually rely on just one person and a driver. I've seen in a few cases where the driver is also the fixer, but that's a lot to manage, because oftentimes I've seen like a really good fixer is often when you're in the drive and maybe you're checking out your notebook, he's already on the phone setting up the next appointment or checking things out, and they're kind of always going. But it's a good question. I don't know that we really answered it that well in terms of advice for how to go about it. But I find that these days I'm on several listservs. One of them is from the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism alumni list. And every day an email goes out saying, does someone have a fixer in Benghazi? Does someone have a fixer in some city I haven't heard of, somewhere in the world? So people are always looking for them, and journalists actually are usually quite collegial with sharing, at the very least, fixers they've worked with and someone who could be good to work with, even if it's sometimes like someone who can just translate but doesn't have the contacts. And that reminds me of something I wanted to just mention. Earlier when Patrick said, even Patrick, who knows Iraq so incredibly well and knows all the players and has been going there for years, would still sometimes work with a fixer, in part because of that, that sort of just little feeling of, take this alley, not that one. I wanted to add to that point that I had an Egyptian-American friend, a journalist, Ashraf Khalil, who was working for the LA Times. And he said he found himself shocked that he thought, he's a native Arabic speaker, he could just work on his own in Iraq, and he would have this sort of bevy of children following him on the street saying, hello, mister, what's your name? And he was kind of like, what? I don't get it, and he realized that, okay, so, he's a native Arabic speaker, but he wasn't Iraqi, and he just didn't feel Iraqi to them, and they noticed him, and they would pick on him if he would try to.
And he spoke with an Egyptian accent.
And he spoke with an Egyptian accent as well, exactly. So it's the rare person, even if you have a command of the language, you'd have to have sort of an Iraqi command of the language, in which case, you're not entirely a foreign correspondent. There are people who are like that, but then, that's a rare person who's doing that and working for a major American or British news organization.
Question?
Hi. I actually have two questions. One is that you were talking about the byline earlier, and I think that a big asset of a fixer is obviously their connections, but sometimes stories can be of sensitive nature, and so when you have a choice between a byline and getting recognition for your contribution to a story versus compromising those connections, what kind of weighs in? What are the choices that you make? And then the second one is, assuming that you are very embedded and have all these connections, but you're also in a deeply polarized country, do you then, as a foreign correspondent, rely on different fixers for different perspectives on a specific story? Or would you still stick with one fixer because you have that special connection with them? So two very different ones.
Could you repeat the first one quickly?
Sorry, the first one is, would you rather have the byline, or would you rather be behind the scenes and keep your connections?
It really
safe?
Depends on the story.
Yeah.
It depends on the story. My first byline was, they offered that. So I wasn't aware about the fact that I'm entitled to a byline in such a case. So I was offered the byline, and then I agreed to it. But in a lot of cases, you feel you should add it as a contributed in reporting, or because in a lot of cases I know that the story would not agree with the person we were interviewing. So it's I usually introduce myself as the interpreter or the translator. So I have nothing to do with that after leaving with the room. It doesn't, in Libya's case, it doesn't necessarily, it's dangerous, especially nowadays, for me to get killed or whatever, but it's to be on the good side of people and to have another chance to interview those people.
I'll take a crack just at that second half of the question and say, if you have the resources, there are times where you might say, I'm going to work with this fixer just on this story because it has to do with, security sources, or, if it were in the days of, covering Afghanistan, it was like journalists wanted to get in with covering the Muj, the Mujahideen, as people, call it in Muj for short. And, probably there were certain fixers who worked with them and had the connections with them, and they weren't necessarily, somebody who was sitting in Kabul who you were working with day in and day out. And in a place like Iraq, because it is,
there are no places like Iraq.
Yeah, there are no places like Iraq. So in Iraq, although, I could think of similarities between Iraq and Lebanon, which I've only been to once, but in terms of, I was going to speak about the different, Sunni, Shiite, Kurdish, etc. There are, different divisions in Lebanon as well that I could think of similar issues. And from what I've been reading about Syria, there's more going on there as well in terms of the divisions. But what I was going to say is, if I were working in Baghdad and I had a really great fixer and he said, oh, let's go do a story in Kurdistan, I'd say, actually, I think I'd rather go there and work with a fixer who's based in Iraqi Kurdistan and really knows everyone there, because even though, I probably could manage with somebody from Baghdad, it won't be as good as someone who's based there, and people from one region often mistrust people from the other region and that sort of thing. And I've had several experiences like that in different countries where you leave the big capital city with your fixer and you go to another part of the country, and they're sort of sometimes seen as a little bit mistrusted by local people. So it can be a tough decision about whom to work with. But if you decide, oh, I'm going to work with someone local, then maybe your main fixer in Kabul is going to say, oh, why are you not taking me to Mazar-e-Sharif with you, which is in northern Afghanistan? Because I could do that story too, and as you might hurt his feelings if you say, no, actually I want to work with somebody local there. So it's you're constantly kind of skating along the line between protecting yourself and also trying to get the story you want to get as safely as you can, and also wanting to keep the people you're working with feeling both happy and respected. And one of the things that came up in this conversation I had with Lise the other day, she said a lot of people feel that the word fixer is not respectable and it's dismissive. And I tried to play with that a little bit in the book and thinking about, well, is it or isn't it? And I think it depends on how it's used. In some cases, I think it's sort of such as on this panel, we're recognizing the incredibly important role that they play. But then there are people, in journalism who will sometimes say, well, get your fixer to do that, And there's a bit of a sort of dismissive tone in it sometimes, that sort of, treating them as, sort of like second-class citizens within the world of journalism, which I find troubling. And I think it's changing a bit as time goes on, and they're getting more recognition, such as the club having a fixers fund, or such as people who are fixers, getting a byline in the story and becoming, now I would say you're a journalist, but you maybe started out, both fixer and journalist. But there was a time
and
when
you can build a house.
Yes, exactly. And you could build my house. I wish we would do that. But
I'm going to be passing out my phone number.
Yeah. But when I started out, in journalism about 20 years ago, I mean, it was very unusual for anybody who wasn't a staff writer to get a byline in the New York Times, and it didn't matter. They would just say, from a correspondent in Benghazi, right? And there are times when, sure, perhaps, as according to to the point that you had just made, perhaps there are times when someone doesn't want a byline because maybe it might compromise their safety. But I think by and large, people do want credit most of the time, unless there's a very specific reason, a real threat that's connected to the story. I think people do want credit for their work, and there was an era when the local people were very often not getting that credit, and I think the general trend is towards giving more credit to the local staff that are making the stories happen, and that's a good thing.
Take some fresh people.
Hi. I was really struck by Sullivan's statement when he said that they just don't do that with the using fixers instead of foreign correspondents. I was just wondering, in perhaps like 20 years, would foreign correspondents be more cultivators of thousands of different sources, or would they always be needed for the to put it in the context in which the nation in which the newspaper is based understands? What do you think the future of foreign correspondency is in 20 years? And the question's for the three Western journalists.
Patrick?
Well, how about next year? I think we should. That's what I really think about. But 20 years can look after itself, so far as I'm concerned. Maybe a matter of age. Less of them around, I guess. Foreign correspondents. On the other hand, it's there aren't sort of newspapers and television sort of think of, is there a way around this? That we could sort of how's reporting? How good is foreign reporting now? How good was reporting of Libya, of Syria. It's got a lot more dangerous, this sort of scattered fighting, it's also the system of embedding seems to me very negative. There's a little point I just want to make. I mean, it is actually just quite useful if you go somewhere that a society you don't know, to have somebody who's from that society talking to you. I mean, just a common sense. Actually, I was just thinking when people were talking, would it have been good for British correspondents to covering the American presidential election to have American fixers? Would it be better for American correspondents in Britain to have British fixers?
In America, they have so many PR people and lobbyists surrounding them, they don't really need fixers.
Yeah, but would just on occasion, just watching sort of British coverage of America, you can sort of sense a cultural disconnect, that there are various things the British just don't understand about America, and foreigners don't necessarily understand about Britain. It used to strike me when I was in Belfast in the 70s, during the fighting there. People, it's all the same language and so forth, but all the foreign correspondents at the Europa Hotel, often there was a sort of disconnect. They didn't quite understand the mechanism of Northern Irish society on both sides of the divide, that they would have been really useful for them to have somebody local who at least they talk to the whole time. Taxi drivers are good, but perhaps have a certain bias. But
sorry, Sarah, just because you've had two questions, I'm going to give somebody else a chance. If you wait for the microphone.
Sorry, just to Patrick Coburn, did you have a fixer in Northern Ireland in the 70s? And were they? Or
No, I didn't, because I was working partly. I was doing my second degree there, and I sort of moved into journalism. So, I mean, actually, the next meal was the question for me. Not I certainly wasn't going to feed anybody else. So I didn't. But you could sort of sense somehow, although their correspondents were living in the middle of the city, and sort of moving around the same language and so forth, they didn't quite sort of click as to why various things happened.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Steve. Go ahead.
What I need to know, and I'm serious, it's an imperative. How dangerous is this compared to other occupations at the same level of risk? It's important to me.
Do you mean being a foreign correspondent or a war correspondent overall versus other occupations, or within journalism?
Doing this compared to other high-risk occupations. Because it seems to me there are a lot of accidentals in terms of your own life. And if, as I believe, this is not living now, it is not a rehearsal. To make those kind of decisions that you put yourself in harm's way and in jeopardy, how do you go about this and come out doing the job you need to do, and then keeping your own head together for the next time you're going to do it again? Because I must say, I'm terribly disturbed by this. And then I wonder, how much are you in harm's way compared to other high-risk situations?
Can I just ask a response question? Are you more disturbed when I do it than when Patrick does it because I'm a woman?
No, I'm asking that of everyone.
Okay, I'm just curious. But it's a good question.
Do you have an answer? Or?
Yeah, I think one, it's got more dangerous than it used to be for a couple of reasons, or probably more than a couple. But one is sort of scattered fighting, where you don't know where the front line is always dangerous, because you don't know, are you through the front line or not? It's not sort of positional warfare. That's always going to be dangerous. Secondly, we're talking about Belfast when I was in the 70s. At that time, I used to say to sort of various sort of gunmen, that they appointed a press officer before they bought a gun. They were very into sort of cultivating the press, not killing them. But Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, there are a lot of people who sort of think foreigner, it doesn't matter if you're a correspondent or not, or Iraqi or Libyan or somebody else working with foreigners, let's kill them right now. So in that way, it's got much more dangerous. And there isn't a great deal one can do about that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would, add to that it seems like a cyclical issue, the degree to which the story is dangerous. For a while, the story covering Iraq got extremely dangerous. I think it's a little bit less so now. Not that it's not still dangerous, but there was a time when, it wasn't just the sort of, resentment of the West and the occupation. Well, of course, that's certainly the framework for some of the anger, but, it was kind of a business as well. It was sort of, you kidnap, a foreigner and you hand it over to Group X, and Group X will pay you such and such amount of money, which, you know, finances your military activities. And it was kind of a whole cottage industry for a while, and, you know, that's been written about. And so, you know, I did get to a point when I found that, you know, off-putting in terms of going back to Iraq for a while. And it was after the fixer I'd worked with, whose name is Alan Anouia, who was an Iraqi Christian, was killed, you know, just, you know, 2 weeks or so, or 3 weeks after I'd worked with him. And I found, you know, the whole thing very disillusioning, and I, you know, asked myself, you know, should we have had more security? What could we have done? And you know, there are cases like this, you know, all the time where it's happening. So I don't know how to really answer the question. You know, I felt like when I was covering these stories, although I knew that there was obviously a danger element, it felt like it was an extremely important thing to be doing with my life. It was meaningful, and it was a sense that I get to be a witness to history, you know, a small little window on history that each of us gets to have when we see a society in the midst of conflict, in transition. You know, it's kind of a privilege. And, you know, and I think, I hope that journalists who do this kind of reporting go into the field with that in mind, and I think hopefully in the back of our minds we do, but I for sure saw people around me at times who kind of were adrenaline junkies, and I asked myself at one point, you know, is this, you know, what I've become, that I feel most alive when I'm sort of, you know, out on assignment in Iraq and not back at home, and so you know, and I'm doing less of that now. I mean, I live in Jerusalem, so I'm still covering occasionally, you know, stories to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But to me, it's nothing these days like you know, the dangers of working in Iraq and Afghanistan. You know, I think there's always going to be, to answer the question over here about, you know, how is it going to change in a year or 20 years? You know, I myself, even though I consider myself on the cusp of sort of, you know, I'm not fresh out of school, but I'm still in the young-ish generation of journalists, and yet I feel overwhelmed by the pressures that new media have put on journalists. As I was saying before, that, you know, it used to be that you could go out in the field and you would focus on your story, and as long as you came home with a great story at the end of the day, or even after a couple of days, your editors were happy. And these days, it seems like there's a competition for how much can you tweet while you're in the field.
So everyone's a wire service reporter.
Yeah, exactly. You're basically a wire service person, and you're supposed to be updating all day long on what you're working on and tweeting your pictures. And, you know, how many times did the story did your tweet get retweeted? I mean, this is one of the barometers by which we're starting to judge journalists, and I find that concerning, because I wonder, you know, is that really the recipe for doing great journalism? And I get the sense here that some people in the audience might be journalism students, so I want to sort of put forth the idea of, you know, kind of resist, you know, some of that. I mean, I mean, Twitter is very important. All the social media is playing a huge role in the Arab uprisings in the last 2 years. So I don't knock it at all, but to say, you know, I think the ideal is to still go out and do more in-depth real journalism, that, you know, you can't really process the story within an hour, that you need more time to get into it. And you know, one term that we, you know, used to talk about in journalism was this idea of, you know, parachute journalism, of just parachuting in, and the people who parachute in all the more so need fixers. So, you know, your hope is that you're not someone who just parachutes in, that you actually get to know the culture, you spend time there, and that if you do still work with a fixer, even after getting to know the story for 10 years, you're doing it in part, you know, not just because of the contacts, but maybe a little bit because of your safety, and also because if you work with somebody who you enjoy working with, and I have a feeling, you know, probably the people who worked with you, it sounded when we were talking before, you know, you had a great time oftentimes working with him. It was very interesting and challenging, etc. It's a lot of fun, and I'll say, you know, as someone who's based in Jerusalem, I'd been to Gaza many, many times, so at some point I realized I don't need to do, you know, have a fixer for the story in Gaza. I'll just set my appointments and I'll go there on my own. And I did that a few times, and it just felt a little bit boring. It didn't feel as much fun as it had been when I'd been working with a fixer, because the fixer is not just working for you, but it's kind of your companion and your friend, and you're kind of on this journey together to get the story. And, you know, if you enjoy that kind of work, when it's good, it's brilliant. It's really amazing, and it's not quite as much fun to just be one lonely man or woman out there in the field working on your own, in my opinion.
We have time for 2 more questions, I think. There was one here.
In all your careers as journalists, and you've seen humanity at its ugliest, and you must have seen firsthand horrific things. Are you a human first, or are you a journalist? Do you intervene, or do you write down the story? And how do you deal with that in the spur of the moment, and how do you cope with that after it?
We'll take this from Simon first.
I think First of all, you become addicted to this sort of thing. You know, you cover a war and you're looking for the next war, even though you don't want to admit to it. And seeing the humanity at its ugliest becomes, in a scary way, normal. You still have a reaction to what you see, but at the same time you're more used to it now. You're more balanced and more in check. You see, for example, at the beginning of the Libyan war, seeing dead bodies was unusual, and at that point you see the dead body, but you don't notice the details of the body, and then maybe it's too graphic for you. But later on, you learn, because you want more details, or maybe it's subconsciously you want more details about the scene. You find yourself going through those bodies, not touching or anything, but just observing and not having the same reaction you had the first time. I'm not sure if that answered the question.
Yeah. Well, no. I guess I would just say, you do sometimes see really kind of the darkest side of humanity, as it were. But I think you can also see, oftentimes in society, in conflict, you see the way that people come out and help each other, that sometimes can be very beautiful and really moving. And I've seen that in many countries, that, there's this sort of an attitude towards, helping your neighbor at times in the middle of a war. That I think is sometimes you basically seeing the best and the worst of people. I would just add that.
Patrick, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is, it would not about being a foreign correspondent, and it's always worse if you actually live in the country and you can't get out of it. Also, it's much worse if you're with your family. If you're people with their children, it's one thing to be shelled, where in Beirut or Baghdad or wherever it is, and you can sort of stick it, but people who've got their children there, that's really terrifying, so it's always much worse for them. So one shouldn't get too hoity-toity about it. One also doesn't want to go down, and start producing sort of tear-jerk journalism. One could always write a piece in any war, whatever side you're on, about horrible things happening, and you can sort of give the impression that it's sort of absolutely the other side are demonic and this side and are killing children the whole time, and the side you're on are angelic. It's difficult to sort of keep a balance in that, in those sort of cases, but one should do it, even in the sort of most difficult circumstances. And it's worth mentioning, because I don't think that really, in Libya and Syria and Iraq, people really didn't do that. They didn't give a clear picture of how all sides were committing atrocities.
You get a bit of that in Syria as well. Getting a bit of that in Syria as well.
Sure, you were just there.
So we'll have a final question.
It's not really a question, it's a comment which I'd like you to respond to, if possible. I mean, I don't know about Libya or Baghdad, but I've had a lot of experience in Egypt, and Egyptian friends of mine who were involved in the first stages of the Egyptian revolution. I think some of their comments were after the initial stages, where they were very surprised that most Western journalists, as far as they were concerned, did not actually speak Arabic, even though they might be so-called authorities on Middle Eastern affairs. And they felt that if they cannot speak the language, how can they really, tap the pulse of what's going on the Arab
Your microphone's gone down. Did you?
So I think language, although it might be a very obvious thing to say, is still it's something that's.
I think it's working.
Is basic.
I'm going to, because we don't have a lot of time. If there is a question in there somewhere, could you come to it? If there isn't a question, then we'll probably.
Okay, I mean, it's just where journalism is basic. Where you find journalism is now, because I feel that there is a difference between what is available in Twitter and Facebook and Arabic and what's been reported by the mainstream Western media at least, and how, I mean, even if you're not having to retweet all the time, I mean, maybe acting as a filter for what is, you know, being tweeted every day regarding the ongoing revolution in Egypt at least, you know, how do you position yourself in relation to that?
Mm-hmm. I personally haven't so much been covering the revolution in Egypt, but I do follow it a lot, and I agree with you that sometimes, you know, what's being tweeted in English is very different than what's being tweeted in Arabic. You know, I mean, I think the fundamental point of your question, though, is, you know, talking about, you know, journalists and language, and, you know, anytime, you know, someone's, you know, wanting to become a journalist and, you know, asks for advice, you know, I think language is, you know, one of my top ones, you know, like learn it, you know, early, you know, while you can, you know, if you can while you're in school and you have somebody to sort of finance it, or, you know, whatever news organization you're working for, you know, you can often get as part of your benefits package for them to throw in language study, which I, you know, got for years and ended up, you know, getting a sort of mishmash of like 7 languages, and, you know, and kind of functioning in some of them, and, you know, and others, you know, just enough to chat with the taxi driver. But I think the language aspect of it is incredibly important, and yet I think, you know, people who work in the media are expected to not just cover one region of the world their whole lives, but are really expected to sort of also be able to be a generalist and cover many areas. And you can't possibly, I mean, very few people can master, you know, enough languages to say, well, I also have the Arabic, but also the Persian, and also, you know, and also the Chinese. You know, it's sort of, you know, you know, pick a region that you're interested in and learn the language, and then you might end up at some point being sent, you know, elsewhere, and not having the language. So at some point you will, you know, if you go into the foreign media, you know, you will need a fixer or a translator at some point. But I think, you know, to at least make the effort. I mean, I agree with you. I meet people who've been kicking around, you know, the Middle East sometimes for 25 years and can't speak, you know, a word of more than hello, how are you in Arabic, and that does surprise me sometimes, because I think it's, you know, it does make a big difference. You know, even if, you know, as someone who, you know, I can, you know, kind of function in Arabic, but I'm definitely not fluent in Arabic. But I find that even if I could sort of, you know, spend the first 5 or 10 minutes of the conversation, you know, you know, starting off in Arabic, it often, I don't know, I feel like opens doors in ways that if I were just coming in as,
well,
you know,
Anthony
without
Shadid,
a word.
Anthony Shadid, for example, was
Yeah.
clearly close to everyone he spoke to. He fitted in Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Libya, Iraq, everywhere he went. People liked him because he was absolutely fluent in Arabic, very funny in Arabic as he was in English, and I mean, his reporting on top of that was superlative, but his access to the psyche of people, courtesy of his linguistic ability, was exceptional and much missed.
I definitely agree, yeah.
So I think that's it for this evening. I want to thank everyone for coming. Don't forget, Baghdad Fixer is here with autographs by the author, and please come down and have a drink after you've bought the book. And remember, Eileen's parents are here watching to see who does and who does not buy the book. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the reasons I'm not doing the war zone thing at the moment is I have an 8-month-old daughter. So
congratulations.
thank you. So my mother came to help me out with.
And make sure people buy the book.
Yes.